Welcome to my channel. Please click like, share, and subscribe. This is the story of Lawrence Horn, early Motown musical engineer. LT, aka Lawrence Horn, was a DJ during his time in the Navy in the early 1960s. He had also sharpened his skills in electronics after being discharged from the Navy. He inquired about a job with Berry Gordy, and Berry gave him a job. Lawrence was a natural, combining his musical and technical talent. He became Motown's main engineer, inventing vocal mixing techniques that are still being used today. Mickey Stevenson, a writer and producer who worked with Lawrence during the early Motown days, said this about him. He could build equipment which was amazing to us. Not only could he work the stuff, he would go out and put it together. He could have worked for a major manufacturer like Sony. He could actually build things just like people who know how to build a computer. There's a certain kind of genius in that. He had the ability. He was absolutely married to what he did. Detroit was rocking at the time. Berry Gordy Jr. had turned the city into an epicenter of American music in the early 60s with acts like The Temptation and the Supremes. Hitsville, USA, a nickname for Motown, had taken charge, and the company had radio and record companies noticing the power of their product. One of the first talents that Gordy had hired to work wasn't a soulful singer or a house band. It was a Navy veteran with a great talent for electrical engineering, Lawrence T. Horn. Horn, the primary engineer on My Girl, was on fire. He was behind the boards for hits from Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, and Stevie Wonder. He even helped build the 8-track recording machine, and his bank account showed all of his hard work. By the end of the 70s, Motown had created over 100 top 10 hits, and Horn had helped to perfect the sound of almost every one of them. The studio belonged to Horn, and he made sure all the knobs and faders were under his control. When asked about Lawrence Horn, Mickey Stevenson said, "The only thing about him was that when you stepped into the studio, which was our studio, it became his studio. If you touched any of the studio equipment, he would go crazy. He would ask, 'Do you know what you're touching? Do you know what it does? Do you know why it does what it does?' He would go over the whole thing to the point where you would sit there and say, I would like to get a little more height on this. Can you pitch it, please? This is our studio, right?" I mean, he wouldn't go out and tell the musicians how to play their instruments or write their songs, but don't touch the equipment. When he was there, it was his studio. In 1972, Lawrence was flying first class when he met an airline stewardess by the name of Mildred Marcy. Lawrence was married at the time, for a year, to Motown's receptionist, Warner Royster. But when he met Mildred, he was smitten. By 1973, Lawrence and Mildred were married, and the two bought a house in San Diego. Lawrence would split his time between San Diego and LA, where Motown had moved its headquarters. And in 1974, the couple had their first child, Tiffany. Later on during the marriage, things got rocky between Mildred and Lawrence. The couple's relationship was strained, and in 1979, Mildred and Lawrence moved to Washington, D.C., while Lawrence continued his work with Motown in L.A. In 1981, Mildred filed for divorce, but even during this strenuous time, Horn and Mildred would occasionally still see each other. 3 years after she filed for divorce, Mildred gave birth to premature twins, Tamil and Trevor. After 3 weeks, Tamil was released into her mother's care in Silver Spring, Maryland, but Trevor would have to stay much longer. He was born with underdeveloped lungs and needed to be placed on life support. It was September 16th, 1985. Doctors had struggled to insert a tracheotomy tube back into Trevor's throat. It had almost been an hour, and the 13-month-old with the underdeveloped lungs was suffering from a severe lack of oxygen. If it took any longer for the staff at Children's Hospital National Medical Center to reinsert the tube, he would die. Finally, after an hour of work, the tube was back in place. Unfortunately, the damage was already done. Trevor, the son of famed Motown producer and engineer Lawrence Horn, was a quadriplegic. Lawrence and Mildred's relationship had been in trouble for years, but the troubled birth and subsequent near-death experience of their son had completely destroyed their already dissolving bond. In 1987, their divorce had finally been settled, and all three of the children moved in with Mildred. Due to the negligence at Children's Hospital, the Horns won a $2 million lawsuit. The bulk of the money was placed in a trust fund to pay for Trevor's medical needs, but Mildred was rewarded with $250,000, while Lawrence was gifted $125,000. By 1988, with Motown's Hitsville dying down, Berry Gordy sold the empire to MCA for $61 million. Lawrence perhaps began losing faith in the company he helped to build. Lawrence was lost. The Motown sound has faded. As Mickey Stevenson explained, we were family and he was part of the family. Motown was a family. After Gordy sold Motown, Lawrence was no longer perfecting songs for some of music's top stars. He was filing tapes as a librarian, standing firm as one of the company's last original members. This changed in 1990 when he was fired. Merely surviving, Lawrence Horn had gone from mastering the boards to storing tapes in the basement. The former Golden couple were now locked in a heated battle over child support and custody of Trevor. Lawrence owed Mildred $16,875 in past due child support, and by 1992, the $125,000 that Lawrence had been awarded from Trevor's lawsuit against the hospital was gone. He was working as a freelance computer repairman and living in a cheap LA apartment with his girlfriend, barely making it. To make ends meet, Lawrence borrowed $65,000 from his mother Pauline, who had borrowed the money from a family member who was an actor on a different world. Freddie, maybe? Lawrence had nothing. The biggest asset he could think of that was his son Trevor. After Trevor and Mildred, Lawrence would be the next in line to inherit the malpractice money. He came up with a plan. He had decided he would go back to Motown, back to Detroit, where it all started. In the spring of 1992, Thomas Turner heard a knock on the door of his Detroit residence. It was his cousin, Lawrence Horn. Lawrence told Turner about his financial dilemma, the overdue child support payments, and the shabby LA apartment he was now reduced to living in, and how Mildred had all the money and he had nothing. He also mentioned the $1.7 million trust fund in Trevor's name. Turner suggested that Lawrence contact a spiritual advisor, James Edward Perry of the House of Wisdom. He said Pastor Perry helps people and gave Lawrence the pastor's contact information. In the summer of 1992, Lawrence decided he wanted to see his son. He asked his eldest daughter, Tiffany, if she would videotape Trevor in his bedroom where he was hooked up to a respirator every night. Sensing the longing of a parent for a child he really saw, she agreed to do it. While on his way to pick up Tiffany from Mildred's Silver Spring home, Lawrence was doing some recording of his own. The trip from downtown Washington, D.C. to Silver Springs, Maryland is about a 30-minute drive. And using a rented van with a mounted camera, Horn filmed the entire trip. When he arrived at his ex-wife's home, where she lived with her children, he filmed that too. Every inch of the outside perimeter, including the driveway and the address posted on the facade. In an interview with the Washington Post in April of 1993, Horn would state, "I videotaped my entire trip, solely for the purposes of showing my family back home in California." Thomas Turner, meanwhile, continued to be a bridge of communication between Pastor Perry and his cousin Lawrence. He sensed something nefarious was going on between the two. "I got to thinking I was brought into something and I didn't know exactly what," Turner would later testify. "I had my suspicions. I approached Mr. Perry and told him that whatever business he had with my cousin, they should conduct it between themselves." There was one more videotape Lawrence needed to create, though, before he and Perry's plan could come to fruition. The jury watched as the documentary for Miles Davis blasted onto the screen. After a few short moments of the jazz legend blowing on his trumpet, the image cut to another, the inside of a Hollywood Boulevard apartment. It was Lawrence's apartment. He was manning the camera, making sure to tape himself, his girlfriend, and even the time and date on the rolling channel guide scrolling away on his TV screen. It was 11:03 p.m. on March 2nd, 1993. On the other side of the country, in Silver Spring, Maryland, the second half of the plan was about to commence. Perry had done his homework. For $30, he was able to purchase a book published by Palatin Press titled Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, from a mail-order catalog. He followed the literature closely. He filed off the serial numbers as well as a part of the gun barrel of the .22 caliber AK-47 rifle he had acquired, along with putting a silencer to the end of the weapon. What happened next also followed the details laid out in the book. It was sometime after 2 a.m. at the home in the North Gate Drive cul-de-sac where Mildred and the children lived. Trevor Horn was in his nursery, hooked up to the respirator that served as his lifeline. Sitting next to him was Janice Saunders, his caregiver. Perry snuck into the basement window. He found his first victim, Mildred, at the base of the stairs and shot her in the head 3 times, with one bullet traveling through her right eye. He then made his way undetected to the nursery where Trevor and Saunders were located. Bursting into the room, he shot Saunders twice in the head at close range, once in the left eye. This method of killing, shooting someone at close range and in the eye, is described in the book Hitman as a certain way to ensure quick and sure death. The book does not go into detail, though, in how to murder a young disabled child. Perry hovered over Trevor's body, the child laying in a crib among several stuffed toys. With gloved hands, Perry placed one hand over the tracheotomy opening in his throat and the other hand over his nose and mouth. At 7:30 a.m., Mildred's sister and a neighbor came into the home, the loud alarm on the disconnected respirator echoing throughout the house. Trevor Horn, Mildred Horn, and Janice Saunders were dead, and a single blade of grass lay on Trevor's cheek. Perry, in all the wisdom that he had gained from the book, left no discernible or traceable evidence at the scene of the crime. I guess the police have to do their job, Lawrence said in an interview with the Washington Post 5 weeks after the murders. I just want it to be over with because it's been a nightmare. Little did Horn know, investigators were acquiring a mountain of evidence against him. First, police found a piece of paper in Horn's pocket on the night of the killings. The flight numbers and times written on the paper corresponded with the flight Mildred was scheduled to work on the day she died. About a week after the murders, a flight attendant who worked with Mildred contacted the Montgomery County Police and told them that Mildred had feared that her ex-husband would try to kill her. On March 12th, along with the videotapes that Horn made, police seized computers, audio cassettes, computer discs, and more. Receipts showed that Horn had made several trips between Maryland and Perry's native Detroit. Then there was a phone call that Horn made to Mildred on the night of the murders. The police found it suspicious that Horn would call solely to check on the whereabouts of his other two children mere hours before the slayings. Their conclusion was that he wanted to make sure they were not there when Perry arrived. That same search of Horn's apartment also turned up another highly incriminating piece of evidence, a hand-drawn map of Northgate Drive where Mildred lived. Authorities had all they needed to place wiretaps on Lawrence's phones in California. Meanwhile, Lawrence was trying desperately to access the money that he was due to inherit from Trevor's estate. But his planned hit had a snag. His daughter Tiffany, along with two of Mildred's sisters, blocked him from obtaining the inheritance under Maryland's Slayer rule. The law disqualifies a person who feloniously and intentionally kills another person from benefiting from the estate. Insurance proceeds or property of the decedent and such a person also may not benefit from the estate. Insurance proceeds or property of the decedent as a direct result of the disqualification of the killer, despite being innocent of any wrongdoing. Lawrence couldn't access the money, and Perry could not get his part of the reward for the killings. Authorities knew that because of his financial situation, Horn had plenty of motive to have Mildred and Trevor killed. They just needed more evidence, and the wiretaps and phone records provided just that. Police recorded several instances of Perry and Lawrence talking over the phone, but it was a phone call on the night of the murders that helped to seal their fate. A phone call to Lawrence's apartment was made from a Montgomery, Maryland Days Inn, roughly a 30-minute drive from Silver Spring, Maryland, where the murders occurred. Perry had been efficient and skilled in conducting the murders, but he made one fatal mistake. He registered at the Days Inn with his actual driver's license. On July 19, 1994, after a 16-month FBI investigation, Perry and Lawrence were arrested in Detroit and LA, respectively. In terms of manpower and hours, said one investigator, this was a very intense, time-consuming case. To see a handicapped child murdered was completely unacceptable. James Edward Perry's trial was held before Lawrence Horns, and the evidence was damning. Between the tapped phone calls, travel logs connecting the two associates, telephone records on the night of the murders, and the evidence that Perry had purchased the Hitman book, which he followed precisely, it was enough to convince a jury of his guilt. In order to link Perry and Lawrence even more than they had already, prosecutors granted Lawrence's cousin Thomas Turner full immunity in exchange for his testimony, and he told the court everything. He explained how he introduced Lawrence to Perry, how he kept lines of communication open between the two parties, how he refused to cooperate with the two after the murders. Hints that they were doing something so nefarious it sickened him. In October 1995, James Edward Perry was convicted of a triple homicide and sentenced to death. Perry, though, professed his innocence. The finders of fact found me guilty and have imposed the death penalty, he proclaimed after the trial. But I stand before you this evening and say I had nothing to do with these crimes. I am innocent, and I will continue to fight the good fight. In January of 1996, it was Lawrence Horn's turn for a trial in masterminding the murders of his ex-wife and child. Like James Edward Perry, the evidence provided an insurmountable task for his legal team to defend against. The jury watched the videotapes in his possession, the surveillance video he made in the van, the video of Trevor's bedroom, and the alibi video he made on the night of the murders. They saw the map of Northgate Drive that Horn had drawn, along with the paper in his pocket he had on the night of the murders containing Mildred's flight information. They heard the recorded conversations between Perry and himself. They saw the financial records that had proven Lawrence was desperate for money. Lawrence's mother, Pauline, testified that her son's financial situation was dire and listed out the times he borrowed money from her just to pay the bills. Thomas Turner, just as he did at Perry's trial, testified once again, providing that Horn and Perry conspired through him to plan the murders. In all, there were over 700 prosecution exhibits linking Lawrence and Perry to the killings. Mickey Stevenson told Uproxx about the disbelief he felt overcome with when he learned about his former co-worker's crimes. I was in shock because his passion was the arts. Once you get involved in your passion, your first love of the arts, that's where your mind stays. So obviously, something changed for him. It had to, because he was completely 24/7 an engineer. Now, something changed to that. It had to take over, and I would have to be a psychologist with him 24 hours a day to tell you what that was. On May 17, 1996, Lawrence T. Horn, the man who had spent countless hours perfecting the sound of one of America's greatest musical institutions, was sentenced to life in prison. The years of him refining some of the greatest voices and sounds to brilliance, erupting out of speaker boxes and radios with the sheen and gloss, infecting the ears of young America, was over. The art was gone. The passion had evaporated. But as those things faded, a desperation for the money needed to continue to support a life of comfort set in. For Lawrence Horn, that desperation was so great that he was willing to take the lives of his ex-wife and child. Lawrence's daughter, Tiffany, cried out in court, "I hate you. I hate you so much you killed my family." Deputies led Lawrence Horn away, his destiny to live forever in a cell. Saying no words in response, Horn just shook his head. In December of 2009, James Edward Perry died in a Maryland hospital from illness at the age of 61. He never saw an execution. Lawrence Horn also passed away while he was in prison. This was the story of Lawrence Horn. What a tragic story. R.I.P. to little Trevor, and R.I.P. to Mildred and their nurse. Money is the root of all evil. Peace and love.